Pre-made loops and presets have one big problem. They never perfectly fit together. So you end up mixing your track for hours and hours, trying to give it that big, powerful, cohesive feel of your reference tracks, only to find out that something's off in the original sound design of your synth. Now, here's where it gets interesting. If you're then trying to fix that synth preset and tweak it to fit your song, you will be hopelessly lost because whoever created it in the first place, they probably made it so complex and so overprocessed with effects so that it sounds impressive on its own, but not in the context of your specific production. And so what ends up happening is you try to tweak that sound, but whatever you do, you're just making it worse. Now, I'm not saying that you should never use presets or that all presets are bad. But I think you need to pair the power of presets with the knowledge and the skills of sound design, of coming up with your own sounds and tweaking sounds to your liking. And only once you combine those two worlds, then you can make the most out of it and create songs that actually sound great. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through a simple 5-step sound design framework you can use in any synth to take your tracks from good to great. If you're new to this channel, my name is Philip from Pick Yourself. I've produced, mixed and mastered music for almost 2 decades now. I do it professionally in my studio in Berlin, as well as now my remote setup in beautiful Valencia in Spain. I'm there right now for a couple of months. My goal for you is to make better music, release it, and get on that constant path of professional artistic growth, and this is what I'm here for. Like I said, this framework works for any synth, so you can use it in Serum, you can use it in Vital, you can use it in Diva, whatever you may be using. I'm going to be using the new Meld synthesizer in Ableton Live 12, and the reason for this is a lot of people have trouble with this synthesizer, like dialing in good sounds on their own and going beyond presets. Now, here's our lead melody, and I'm going to play it in solo and then flip on the rest of the music for the context. Now, most producers would jump straight in, adjust the waveforms, adjust the filter settings, the envelopes, and basically tweak the synth to perfection, to then, at the very end of the process, slap on something like a delay. Now, this is where it gets tricky. I think this should be pulled to the very beginning of the process, because a delay is something that has a lot of musical information, a lot of impact on how the final sound will be perceived. It actually creates repetition of notes. It has a rhythmical component, a sonic component, and if you tweak the synth and make it super rich sounding and then slap on a delay at the end, chances are you're just making everything super muddy and it's just not going to work. So step 1 in my framework is to bring in delay and maybe even something like a reverb early on to, first of all, give that musical context, but also already helping it sound a bit better. So you're listening to the sound design and massaging the synth preset or the synth patch in the way that it will in the end be perceived by the listener. So let's do that. I'm going to use the Ableton Echo. That's actually one of my favorite delays. It's better than so many third-party tools. I'm a big fan of dotted eighth delays, so this is why I'm not changing the timing on this. What you can sometimes do is to change the percentage here to differentiate left and right side even more. That is quite nice. Like that a lot. You can also change the modulation settings and the character a little bit. For example, adding noise, add a little bit of wobble to give it a little bit more of that retro sound. But these are things that I would actually dial in the synth patch first of all, and then see later on if I actually need some more of that in the Echo. So for the reverb, we're going to use the Ableton Hybrid Reverb. I like this one a lot because it has this combination between a convolution part, so like a real impulse response from a room. I've actually made a video about reverb specifically, so you know what I'm dialing in here. And the other part of that reverb is an algorithmic reverb that is quite complex sounding, quite rich. And you can combine those two either in parallel or in serial, one after the other, and you can create really interesting reverb textures with that. Now I'm going to not dial this into perfection. I'm going to use early reflections reverb here. Intimate Space, for example, is a really good one. And for the algorithm, I'm just going to keep it on dark hall, but blend them in parallel so that there's more of the early reflections part right now and not so much from the lush tail, because I still don't know how I will set up the synthesizer itself. If I use a synthesizer setting that has like a long release time where the synth rings out, and I also have a super lush reverb, then it's probably going to end up super muddy. So that's really nice. And we already have some more context, some more richness around the sound, and we know exactly what notes are going to be played. Now, if you got some value out of this video so far, consider liking this video, consider subscribing to the channel. This really helps me. It also helps you because the algorithm will put better content in your feed and not just the latest strategy or cat video. Now it's time to actually dial in the synth sounds. Now, the second big issue I see again and again, no matter what synthesizer you're using, is that people who are less experienced with sound design try to dial in everything all at once, using all the oscillators, using all the filters, all the envelopes, and basically getting confused and overwhelmed during that process. My recommendation for you, and this is step 2 of my process, is to mute everything but the original oscillator, like the first oscillator you have, and dialing this in first of all with a setting that provides a stability and like a core sound that you can then build on top of, and dial in the rest of the sounds to complement this original sound. So that's exactly what we're doing. We've muted the second oscillator and we basically try to find a shape that we like. I'm just going to flip through a couple of them. I like this one, the swarm sine, quite a bit. I'm going to show you why, because these are kind of macro settings for that specific oscillator. It would be the same in something like Vital or something like Serum. You would basically sweep through the wavetable and see how different parts of it sound. That's just something that is specific to Meld, but in another synth you would just see like, okay, which part of the wavetable would you use? Now this is also creating some type of a supersaw sound. In other parameters of other synthesizers, that would be the spread, like how stuff is spread out, how much of the unison you would be using basically. Let's put that in context. Giving us a nice texture, some richness, but still has that clarity that I actually quite liked about the original kind of sine sound. And we can challenge this with, for example, a more gritty tone. So instead of swarm sine, we could use like swarm saw, for example, which has more overtones. And this is a decision that you have to make, like how rich do you want your sound to be or how precise and sparse. So everything that's more like a sine wave or a triangle wave is much more sparse and well defined. Something like a square or a sawtooth has more overtones. That means it just sounds richer, but also like a little bit less clear. Also quite cool. I must say, like, for this video, I actually like this swarm sine, maybe swarm triangle. Swarm sine because too many people are using just hyper saw sounds, and this time I want something a bit more defined and clear. So in 90% of classic synthesis synth patches, you will make the final sound out of a combination of whatever oscillator you chose in combination with what filter you chose, and then which types of envelopes you map to those to kind of control how they're opening up. Here we will use the filter for oscillator A. Right now this is a really relaxed 12 dB per octave filter, which means it's like cutting off not too steep, just very gentle. To use something more extreme like this 24 dB, it cuts off a bit more steep. So that's definitely like a difference here. You could also try some of the more complex filters here, but in my opinion, with the more stable sound of the first oscillator, you definitely want to also go for a filter setting that is not too crazy, because otherwise you will end up with a sound that just lacks that richness and stability. At least if we're talking about stuff like lead sounds and bass sounds. So I'll actually keep this first filter, I like it quite a lot. And now this is the part that is most often underrated. Whatever you dial in for the amp envelope, which is basically how the shape of the overall envelope of that sound fades in, how it stays there, how it fades out, and the modulation envelope that you can map, for example, to the filter. So when does the filter close and open? These are the things you really have to get good at if you want to get better at synthesis. If you don't know how to create envelopes that make sense and you don't know what they do, you really have an issue. So let me give you the quick and dirty explanation here. Let's focus on the amp envelope, so the overall output amp of that oscillator here. We have the different phases here: attack, decay, sustain, and release. And these stages all have a different purpose here. So for the attack, this means how does the sound start? Does it fade in gradually, like this? Or does it start immediately, like this? Then decay is basically how quickly is that sound dropping off. Sustain is how long is it then being held on that level, and release is how does it ring out. And attack and release are actually the parameters that make the most difference. So attack I've already shown, and release, if I have a direct cut of release, it's like pressing a piano key, and if you then take your finger off that key, the sound stops immediately. Now we have an echo, which is why I said put this before, because otherwise it gets messy when you then try to play with the other parameters. But let's, for example, take that echo and reverb off for a moment to show you what the release does. And I will keep them on because they're part of the music themselves, and I will just dial in a shape that actually makes sense for the sound. So I want some of that plucky quality. I want it to ring out a little bit, but I don't want it to flood everything. So this is why I dialed it in this way. Now the second envelope is, and this is the same in every synthesizer, you can map envelopes to pretty much everything. This just happens to be the envelope that is mapped to the amp, to the final amplification stage. But obviously you can also use an envelope to tell the filter when it's supposed to open up and cut down. So let's try this out. We're going to the modulation matrix and map that envelope, the modulation envelope, to the filter frequency. So you have to close the filter down first of all. Go to the envelopes. And so you can dial in exactly the type of shape that you want. How is that sound getting brighter or not? How's the overall sound fading in and ringing out? All of this can be done inside this envelope modulation. Now I have one word of warning for you. There is this urge that you have to resist. This urge to use like a ton of immersive unison spread in your synth and to stack them. I will just show you what that does. So I could use the spread here. And stack ton of voices so the sound gets richer and richer and richer. The issue is if you do this too early in your process, you're probably doing yourself a disservice, and you're basically making the same mistakes that all of the preset manufacturers do, because they create a sound that sounds super great and immersive on its own, but actually in the context of a whole song, it just muddies everything up. So I would do this relatively late in the process. Now, obviously, I've chosen a standard swarm sine here, and swarm means just there's like a ton of sine waves stacked here, and I put some of them in, but I did it relatively carefully. I would not like combine this with even more stacked spread and unison sounds. And here's also a video that explains why this messes up your mono compatibility of the sound, in case you want to find out more about the background of this. By the way, if you need help with finishing songs and not just the sound design portion of it, I have a free gift for you. It's called the Finisher Framework, my 3 simple steps that you can use to finish at least one great sounding song per month. This is the goal that I have for you, and you can get it for free at pickyourself.com/framework. The link is also in the description. Now at this point in the process, this is where you would bring in other oscillators, if you even need to. And the second oscillator would basically serve the function of providing some more edge, some unique character, some additional modulation to the sound that just gives it a certain unique quality and texture that you don't find anywhere else. So how do you do that? Well, one of the strategies is to use a little bit more weird wave shape for that. Here we have this thing that's called TARP. I'm just going to show you just the second oscillator. So it's a little bit like a laser sound. I find it quite cool. And you can also, for example, push this up an octave to then combine it with the original sound. Let's just play both of them together and just dial in a setting where the second one complements the first one. And this is also where you need to pay attention to the levels. Sometimes you just have to use a little bit less of that second oscillator so that it doesn't become the first voice in the patch. Now here you can also play with very interesting filter settings that might give this a unique character. So let's try that out. I'll just use, for example, this membrane resonator, which is a very weird sounding one. In other synthesizers, you can try out something like vowel resonators, for example, comb filters. All these different, more unique sounding filter shapes make sense in that context. At this point, you can also go beyond the traditional envelope shapes. So for example, if I use that modulation envelope and I put it into loop mode, which means this will be played again and again, we'll go to the matrix and then map this modulation envelope to, for example, the filter, this membrane filter. As you can see, this is looping very, very fast. Put down the decay, for example, even more. The sustain also more. Notice how this creates overtones on its own. You don't really have to do it in this way if it doesn't make sense. This was just to show you. But another thing you can do is you use an LFO instead for the modulation. So for the LFO, that's a low frequency oscillator. That means it just sweeps between different settings or parameters. So it starts at a very negative value and then goes to a very positive value. And so it cycles between this, for example, filter opening up, closing down, and always the same rhythm. And obviously you can also adjust the shape of this LFO to be a little bit different. So here, for example, we have this wanderer phase, which is slightly more relaxed LFO. So you hear that sometimes it just gives it that nice little nudge where the filter is approaching a certain sweet spot, which is really, really nice. These are just some of the tools that you can use. You can go many more levels complex, and I will show you this in the next steps. Don't worry, this is not too complicated. It's just a level deeper that gives you more capabilities, but we're basically building on the same skills and knowledge that we already have at this point. Now, as you can see, we already have put this one octave higher than the original sound. Now, a lot of people detune those two synthesizers against each other. So the send setting here is just different percentages of a semitone. So this is the octave, this is the semitone, and this is the percentage within one semitone of detuning. You can tune, for example, one up and the other one down a little bit to create interesting sounds. Or what I like to do is I keep the first one stable. So this is my stable foundation. And then the second one, I actually modulate the detuning. So I can go, for example, to the envelopes, use envelope 2 here, just use a triangle shape, use a musical value. So we will put this into something a bit weird, something like 3 bars. And we will then use the second LFO to detune over the course of 3 bars. This will cycle between different values of the detuning, the second oscillator. And you notice that some of these like slight changes here start to make a huge impact on the overall uniqueness of that sound. And now that leads to step number 4 in my process, and that is you have to modulate much more than you actually think you need to in a synth patch to make it interesting, to make it evolve and stand out from all the other patches out there. One cool way you can use to modulate things even more is to use LFOs. We'll now choose the second LFO of the first oscillator and use some random shapes. So here, for example, I have this random sample and hold, which just means different values are randomly assigned. I will not put it in some musical note, and I will use this to modulate a modulator. So for example, this random LFO can now influence the speed of, for example, another LFO. So let's say I use this LFO here, this LFO rate. You can use the random sample and hold function to modulate the other modulator. And now one LFO is influencing the other LFO, so more random stuff starts to happen. I've actually made a video specifically on that technique. You can watch it here, but this is the essence of what I'm explaining there. Now here, that first envelope is so far not doing anything, which is why it's like not too much of, you don't hear anything. But I can now take this first LFO and, for example, map it to, let's say the filter of that first synthesizer and just see what happens. So this is the fun part. You start to explore the synth patch and see what happens if you throw an LFO to this, what happens if you throw an envelope to that, which is why I like these like modulation matrices quite a bit. Almost any synthesizer has this, and if it doesn't, you just have to go directly to the parameters. But if it has a modulation matrix and it's hidden in some menu somewhere, make sure to go there more often than you're doing right now. So LFO1, I can map it to the filter frequency. Down, make it a bit slower. So this is randomly making this LFO faster or slower. And this is quite interesting and unique way of approaching this modulating the modulator type of experience. I actually learned this with modular synthesizers, which is very nice because you have this hands-on experience of connecting one thing to the other thing to modulate the modulator. And it starts to become more real than just seeing it hidden on a screen somewhere. But I want you to get the benefits of all this learning already in the digital form. Now for the final step in my process, let's first of all listen to this in context. You're probably wondering, where are the effects? Now I'm going to put my flag in the ground and say that most of the built-in effects in most of the synthesizers out there aren't that great, and the user interface is kind of not ideal because it's hidden somewhere in the menus. It's very fiddly typically, it's very hard to play with, and you cannot really precisely dial in the parameters in a way you want. Some synthesizers like Serum are a little bit better in that regard. They give you a bit more control, but still I find it quite fiddly. To give you an example, here we have actually a drive parameter, and the drive parameter allows us to add saturation. But there's like no way to dial in what type of saturation, how the transfer curve actually works, and it either works or doesn't, and there's not too much control on top of that. So let's say I wanted to add some more overtones, some saturation, which I think this sound would definitely benefit from, because we chose relatively clean shapes to begin with, and we want to maintain some of that clarity, but also we want to give it a bit more edge and make it cut through the mix a bit more. This is where you would use an external effect, and this is my recommendation to you: always outsourced the effect, because then it's also easier to keep an overview of what's happening in your synth patches. So I'm going to choose RAW, and to be honest with you, it's insane that this is like a stock tool. RAW is such a great distortion tool. I fell in love with it since version 12 of Ableton, and I've used many different distortion tools, but this one is outstanding in the usability, in its depth, and in its sound. I really like this one. So I've put RAW right after meld, and I put it before the other effects because I don't want my echo and my reverb to be distorted like after the fact. I want the distorted version run into the effects. Now, there is no right or wrong. You can obviously also do it the other way around, but this to me gives a bit more control over the original sound, and the end result just, in my opinion, makes more sense because the reverb and the echo, they wash out the sound. If you then distort the washed out sound in the end, it just makes your mix a bit more muddy. So let's see what we can do here. There is, for example, the option to use it in mid-side mode, which I like quite a bit. So we have two different distortion stages, a mid distortion stage is for the center channel and a side distortion channel for the rest. And by the way, if you're not sure about mid-side processing, there's actually a couple of deep misunderstandings on how this actually works. And I've made a video specifically about that, which you can watch here. Here in this mid-side mode, we can, for example, decide to keep the mids a bit more focused, a bit more clear sounding, and distort the sides in a more interesting way. Let's try that out. So be in the mid mode first of all. Now, RAW has this interesting setting where you can actually make up for the type of distortion so that the low end is less affected. I have just a slight tiny crunch on the overtones. Now on the side channel, we will go a bit more extreme and we'll dial in a setting that just crunches the sides in a really interesting way. So the type of wave shape that we're going to use here is going to be a bit heavier. We've now used a bit crusher, which is a relatively extreme digital distortion effect, or reducing the bitrate intentionally. We've used this on the sides, and on the mids we've just used standard soft clipping. This is a very nice combination. Let's see how this sounds in context. I have one one more bonus trick for you, and that is, if you're at this point in the production, you feel like your overall synth sound is great, it's unique sounding, it has something, but for whatever reason, you're running out of oscillators. So this one just has 2 oscillators, and you actually would like to have a little bit more stability below what you're actually creating here and what a little bit more strength. My recommendation is to do the following. You actually just duplicate the track, you get rid of the effects, and then just use a very simple waveform, or just go into the basic shapes here and sweep through them and just see what works, and make this an octave lower. So you create a sub-synth oscillator below what you have. This is something between the square and the saw wave. So here's what it sounds like after taking off some of the modulation, and also I've adjusted the envelope so that it sounds like a bit more stable, a bit more fat and not as plucky as the original one. And yeah, this is how I would do it. Leave a comment below, let me know what you want to learn next. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you in the next video.